The following is produced by the Connell and Kirst Media Group.
When I opened my bakery 3 years ago, I believed that my skill as a baker and my passion for the craft would be enough to ensure success. Episode 1 explored how that belief, what Michael Gerber calls the entrepreneurial myth, led me into exhaustion and near failure. I had created a job for myself, not a business. I was working 18-hour days, trapped by my own creation, and I could not see a way forward. What I share with you in this second episode is what changed everything for me. I began studying other bakeries, both successful ones and failed ones, looking for patterns that would explain the difference. I started to understand that the entrepreneur role I had been neglecting was not a luxury, but a necessity. I learned that external shocks are not exceptional events, but constant features of the business environment that must be anticipated. Most importantly, I discovered that the real decision I faced was not whether to own a business, but whether to build a system or remain trapped in a job I had created for myself. This episode explores why some businesses succeed while others fail, how to balance the three roles within your business, and what it truly means to work on your business rather than just in it. My story has a positive resolution, but only because I finally understood what business ownership actually requires.
Now, while Sarah has developed her skills as a technician and was beginning to embrace that manager role, the entrepreneur was remained really kind of absent from her bakery. The entrepreneur is the visionary, the person who thinks about what the business could become rather than simply managing what it is. The entrepreneur focuses on growth planning, not just responding to current demand, but anticipating future opportunities. The entrepreneur engages in long term thinking, considering where the business should be in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Without the entrepreneur, a business remains stuck in survival mode, constantly reacting to circumstances rather than shaping its own future. So Sarah had never given herself permission to think about entrepreneurship or even give herself the time to think about it. She was so consumed with the immediate demands of that production and operation that strategic thinking seemed like it was going to be just a luxury that she simply wasn't able to afford. And this is precisely the trap that prevents small businesses from growing beyond the capacity of that single owner or that sole proprietor. The entrepreneur asks different questions than the technician or the manager would. The technician asks how to make a product better. A manager asks how to make operations more efficient. The entrepreneur asks what business we're truly in, who we serve, what makes us unique, but more importantly, how can we systematically deliver value that doesn't depend entirely on the owner's personal presence and effort? Without the entrepreneur, Sarah's bakery could never have become more than just an exhausting job that she had just created for herself. So, the natural progression, Sarah began researching other bakeries, both locally in Barrie and right across Canada, trying to understand why some of these bakeries thrived and others struggled or ultimately failed. And she noticed patterns among successful operations. They had strong systems, documented processes that allowed consistent quality regardless of who was working on any given day. Think about McDonald's. Every restaurant you go to, every order that you make tastes the same regardless of where you are within Canada. Now, this helps to maintain a clear customer focus, understanding exactly what the entrepreneur and the organization serve and what the customers value the most. They demonstrated adaptability, responding to changing preferences, market conditions, and those opportunities without losing their core identity. So, one particularly successful bakery that Sarah had studied had grown to 4 locations across southern Ontario. The owner had started much like Sarah as a skilled baker working alone, but had made a crucial transition. She had stopped thinking of herself as a baker who owned a business and started thinking of herself as a business owner whose business happened to be bakeries. And this shift in identity and perspective helped her step back from daily production, focus on those systems, development, and the strategic planning, and build an organization that could operate successfully without her constant presence. The successful bakeries Sarah had studied all shared a common characteristic. They had been built as systems rather than as jobs. They had a clear brand identity, standardized products, procedures, trained staff who could execute these procedures consistently, and most importantly, business owners who spent their time working on the business rather than just in the business. So the pattern of failure were instructive. Cash flow problems topped the list of causes. Many bakeries that produced excellent products still failed because they couldn't manage the timing of the revenue and the expenses. They would invest in their inventory and labor to produce the goods, but if those goods didn't sell quickly, or if the receivables from wholesale accounts stretched out too long, they'd run out of operating cash despite technically being profitable on paper. Burnout destroyed many bakeries, particularly those dependent on the single owner operator. Sarah recognized herself in these stories. Owners would work unsustainable hours for months or years, telling themselves it's only temporary, until their health finally failed, relationships collapsed, or they simply reached a point where continuing was no longer possible or even an option. So, a lack of planning for growth created a different kind of failure. Some bakeries succeeded initially, but they couldn't scale, get bigger. They had no systems, no documented processes, no clear procedures. And as demand grew, the quality became inconsistent. Customers, customer service, for example, deteriorated, and the reputation that had driven the initial growth had basically evaporated. So Sarah recognized that every failure pattern she identified had a corresponding absence to one of Gerber's three roles. Cash flow problems indicated weak management. Burnout indicated the technician dominating without support. Lack of planning for growth indicated the missing entrepreneur. Understanding why businesses fail helps prevent those failures, but also if the understanding leads to action and structural change. So, beyond these internal factors, Sarah had to acknowledge that external shocks could also threaten even the best or well managed bakeries. Economic downturns changed consumer behavior, with people cutting back on their specialty baked goods and gravitating towards cheaper alternatives. During the pandemic, she had watched several local businesses close permanently. They were unable to weather that sudden loss of foot traffic and the cost of adapting to a new safety requirement. So, rising costs presented ongoing challenges. Flour prices fluctuated based on global wheat markets. The energy costs for operating commercial ovens represented a significant expense that could spike unpredictably. Labor costs rose steadily as minimum wage was increased and competition for reliable workers intensified. Regulatory changes such as basically government rules and regulations, etc., would add complexity and expense. Changes to the health code, for example, might necessitate new equipment upgrades. New accessibility standards could require facility modifications. Tax policy changes could affect the profitability and cash flow. And Sarah realized that external shocks were not exceptional events to be survived, but rather constant features of business environment that had to be anticipated, but more importantly, planned for. The bakeries that succeeded in the long term were those with sufficient financial buffers. So, flexible business models and diversified revenue streams that allowed them to absorb those shocks without failing. And this realization reinforced the importance of the entrepreneurial role, because only one person thinking strategically, or someone even thinking strategically about the future, could build that kind of resilient business that could weather those inevitable and oftentimes unpredictable storms. So Sarah began to understand that her business needed a productive tension between entrepreneur and that manager, where the entrepreneur brings vision and the creativity, as I talked about, and the orientation toward growth and change. The manager brings execution capability, structure, and orientation toward stability and consistency. Vision without execution produces nothing but unfulfilled dreams. Execution without vision produces nothing but, there's just nothing there other than a lack of progress or adaptation. Creativity without structure leads to chaos, constant reinvention, and most importantly, physical exhaustion. So, structure without creativity leads to stagnation and an inability to respond to changing circumstances. The relationship between entrepreneurs and managers, whether embodied in a single person who has to shift between the various roles, or multiple people working together, requires a fine balance. Sarah had to learn to give herself permission to think entrepreneurial, to dedicate time to strategic planning and visionary thinking, while also honoring the importance of the managerial work that turns vision into operational reality. Now, this balance is essential, and is really very difficult to achieve, especially when you're a technician, particularly for someone who came to business ownership through that skill rather than through business training. The entrepreneur in Sarah wanted to experiment with new products, explore new markets, and reimagine what that bakery could become. The manager in Sarah resisted, pointing out to the current challenges, limited resources, and most importantly, that need for stability. And finding the right balance meant neither suppressing the entrepreneur nor letting the entrepreneur run wild without managerial discipline. An important realization emerged as Sarah studied both successful and failed businesses, though. Not everyone who possesses entrepreneurial qualities needs to own a business. The concept of intrapreneurship is this innovation within an existing organization offers an alternative path. Sarah met several talented bakers who worked for larger organizations but were given significant autonomy to develop new product lines, to design specialty programs, or manage specific locations. They were able to exercise creativity, make decisions, and see their ideas come to fruition without bearing that financial risk or the operational burden of full business ownership. So, this realization helped Sarah understand that the entrepreneurial myth had presented a false choice. She had believed that to fully exercise her creativity and realize her potential, she had to own her own business. Yet, she met people who were really, truly, deeply satisfied, professionally fulfilled, and financially successful working within organizations where they could reinvent or innovate and lead without ownership. Creativity has several paths, and ownership is only really one of them. So, for some people, the right answer is to own and build a business. For others, the right answer is to bring the entrepreneurial energy to a role within the larger organization. So, understanding The distinction is really important because it helps prevent people from pursuing business ownership for the wrong reasons, from confusing that desire for creative autonomy with the need for complete ownership and control. 3 years into her business ownership journey, Sarah had faced what she now understood as the real decision, the one she had not consciously made when she first opened her bakery. The choice was not simply whether to own a business or remain an employee. The real decision was whether she was building a job or building a system. Had she basically created a business that required her constant presence and effort to survive, or had she created a business that could operate through systems, processes, and trained people? So the question of survival versus design cut to the heart of her challenge. Was she simply trying to survive month to month, reacting to problems as they arose? Or was she intentionally designing a business that could grow, adapt, or even thrive? So the tension between the control and freedom forced Sarah to examine her assumptions. She had left employment seeking that freedom, but she had created a business that ironically controlled her more thoroughly than any of her other employers ever had. So true freedom would come not from doing all the work herself, but from building a system that allowed the work to be done well without her constant involvement. So Gerber's central insight became clear to Sarah through her experience. Most people start businesses to create jobs for themselves, working in the business, while successful entrepreneurs build those systems I've been talking about, working on the business. The shifts from working in to working on requires a fundamental change in the mindset, the identity, but most importantly, that daily practice of the entrepreneur. So, thinking about it, Sarah's story illuminates truths that apply far beyond those bakeries. Passion starts businesses, people open restaurants, consulting firms design studios, and retail shops because they love food, helping clients, creating visual work, or curating products. That passion is essential because starting and running a business is difficult enough that passion may not be the only thing that sustains an entrepreneur through early challenges. However, passion alone isn't sufficient. Systems sustain businesses, documented procedures, trained staff, clear financial controls, effective marketing processes, and systematic approaches to customer service allow a business to deliver consistent value, even when the passionate founder isn't personally involved with every transaction. So finally, vision shapes the future. Without the entrepreneurial vision of what the business could become, without the strategic thinking about growth, market position, that long-term sustainability, a business remains trapped by current circumstances rather than creating its own future. The lesson of the baker applies to any skilled profession considering ownership. So, being excellent at your craft is not the same thing as being ready to build a business. The technician's skills must be complemented by the manager's discipline and the entrepreneur's vision. Sarah eventually transformed her bakery by embracing that lesson. She documented her processes, trained her staff, hired a manager, and began spending her time on strategic work rather than daily production. So she still baked regularly because she loved it, but she no longer had to bake for the business to operate successfully. She had built a system rather than a job. And in doing so, she had finally achieved that freedom that she had sought when she first decided to open her first bakery.
3 years into owning my bakery, I was exhausted and overwhelmed. Something had to change. I started studying other bakeries to understand why some succeeded while others failed. The successful ones had strong systems, clear customer focus, and adaptability. They were built as businesses, not as extensions of the owner's personal effort. The failed ones showed me my own future: cash flow problems, burnout, and inability to scale beyond one person's capacity. I realized I had been completely neglecting the entrepreneur role. I was so focused on surviving each day that I never thought strategically about the future. I had to learn to balance vision with execution, to think about what my business could become rather than just managing what it was. I also discovered that not everyone needs to own a business to be professionally fulfilled. Entrepreneurship offers another path. The real decision I faced was whether I had built a job or built a system. I had sought freedom through ownership, but had created something that controlled me completely. True freedom came when I documented my processes, trained my staff, hired a manager, and started working on my business instead of just in it. I still bake because I love it, but my business no longer depends on my constant presence. I finally built the system I should have designed from the beginning, and that is when I achieved the freedom I had originally sought.